Sand rode the wind as it whipped over the desert dunes, pelting against the courier's thick coat. Looking out through his helmet, the orange mountain ranges in the distance crept closer as they moved across the horizon. "One foot in front of the other, eh, Marco?" the courier asked, patting a hand on his horse. A metallic clank echoed throughout his steed's body, quickly drowned out by the steady whirring of the gears inside. Marco's head lifted, mechanical eyes making contact with the courier's as it nodded in agreement. "Attaboy," the courier smiled, adjusting the straps of his pack. Behind him were bags of varying sizes, filled with packages and supplies he had been charged with delivering to a remote city out in the desert. For the past 2 weeks the courier and his steed trekked through this barren landscape after landing at the capital city's spaceport. Despite his best efforts to find a transport service, the fares were higher than his total payout would be upon delivery. One taximan said something about scabbers and raiders that were harassing the townspeople living at his destination. Letting out a deep sigh, the courier lifted his wrist and wiped sand from the screen of his technobracer. It came to life at his touch, displaying the map as well as his helpful friend, a red arrow that pointed him toward his destination. Zooming out, he was nearing the end of the mapped-out area and entering uncharted territory. When plotting his course to the delivery point, the courier intentionally avoided the main route in order to skirt around any possible trouble. Looking out ahead, he saw the mountain range that separated him from his destination. His fingers danced over the surface of his bracer, inputting the commands for a short-range scan of the area. Through the lens of his helmet, he watched as a blue pulse of energy emitted from his arm, radiating from his position and out over the mountains. Within seconds, the map began filling in with topographical data, detailing large to middle-sized objects on his side of the mountain. With a few more inputs, the red arrow displayed once more, this time pointing in a different direction. "Autopath has found a more efficient route," a robotic voice echoed through his metal helmet. "Would you like to change your course?" A text prompt appeared over the map, showing the 2 trails and displaying their distance and expected arrival time. The new route was shorter by hours, but led over the mountains. The courier knew that without having map data on the other side, the descent might not be as easy as his bracer made it seem. "What do you think, Marco?" he asked, pointing towards the new path. "Should we try that way?" The mechanical horse looked back and forth between the two, almost as if it was weighing the options. After a few seconds, it raised its front left leg and tapped the sandy ground twice, shaking its head in the direction of the mountain. "You sure?" the courier asked with a chuckle. "We don't know what's on the other side yet." Marco lifted his head. The hydraulics that controlled his neck hissed slightly under the strain of the heat and sand, then nodded. "That settles it, then." The two changed course, following the red arrow on the courier's technobracer. Hours passed as they fought against the incline of the mountain, as well as the rough terrain of loose rocks and sand. The new path snaked up, cutting through until it crested over the top of the range. As they neared the top, the courier dismounted, securing the cargo from his back onto the saddle to lighten his load. Overhead, the sun was at its zenith, giving him no shade or protection from its rays. He could feel the sweat evaporating in his helmet and checked his bracer. Helmet temperature rating below environmental standards. Upgrade required. "Well, that's not going to happen any time soon," the courier laughed, reaching up to his head and removing the metal helmet. His curly brown hair dripped with sweat, which fell and was absorbed into the thirsty ground below. Taking a deep breath, the courier could almost taste the sweetness of small round fruits that were ripening on the native cacti nearby. "Whoa," he said, putting out a hand to stop his horse. "Let's take a little break." They moved over to a small patch of the fragrant plants. The courier plucked one of the orange orbs and held it in front of his bracer. Scanner nodes lit, sending an array of blue lasers out to inspect the fruit in his hand. Once it was complete, a detailed explanation of the fruit was displayed, which was promptly skipped to find the more important information: safe for human consumption. "Well, there you have it," the courier said, peeling the thick orange membrane off and inspecting the insides. A yellow fleshy ball lay beneath the skin, filled with thick strands of organic material that held the structure together. Jamming his finger into one end, he pulled it apart until he had 2 halves and popped one into his mouth. Yellow juice dripped down his chin as he chewed. He closed his eyes as he savored the sweet flavor of organic food for the first time in several days. "You've got to try this," he said, offering up the other half to his horse. Marco approached, opening his mouth and licking it with a thick pink artificial tongue. It tested the flavour several times before taking the offered fruit from its partner. The two sat beneath the sun, looking back on the path they had travelled over the past few days from their high vantage point. There was no trace of their journey save for the memories of it, the wind displacing the sand and obscuring their tracks. Both chewed for a long moment, taking the silence in stride as they rested. Several minutes and alien fruits later, the courier lifted his arm and input the commands for another scan. "We're close enough to the top, the scan should be able to cover the other side from this height." Without his helmet he couldn't see the process, but he could feel the energy shift around him as his bracer sent out its signals. It completed, filling in the map and allowing for a more accurate route to be displayed. The courier zoomed in on the new topographical data, interested in seeing how steep the descent would be when something else caught his eye. 3 yellow dots were blinking on the other side of the mountain, and they were closing in on his position. "Shit!" he cursed, standing and donning his helmet. Inside, a notification blinked on the visor. "Caution, cargo pinged by unknown source." The courier reached down to his belt and removed his pistol, making sure to check the small digital display that showed its current charge. Luckily it was full, but he could feel a pit in his stomach growing as adrenaline pumped through his system. "We've got company, Marco," the courier said to his partner. "I need you to be the distraction." The horse shook its head, letting out a loud electronic whinny of disapproval. "We don't have time to argue. You just stay here and I'll try to get the drop on them." Without another word, the courier ran up the ridge, checking his technobracer every few seconds to see how close the enemies were. He came to a stop just below the crest of the mountain and hid behind one of the large red rocks, hiding him from anyone coming from the other side. Only a few seconds passed before he could hear the sounds of footsteps displacing rocks as they moved toward him. Taking in a deep breath, he raised his pistol and readied himself. "Who comes this far off the main path?" he heard a young man's voice ask. "Shh! Keep your voice down, we're getting close," another more gruff voice answered. "But whoever they are, they must have thought we weren't covering this side of the mountain." The courier cursed himself internally and felt the tension building as he waited for them to walk past him. Unfortunately, they didn't. "Hold up here," the older man said from very close by. "Let's scope this out. I've got a bad feeling." Pressing his back up against the rock, the courier looked up and saw the barrel of a makeshift rifle hovering over his head, pointed down in Marco's direction. His heartbeat doubled as he tried to keep his breathing quiet, and he froze to listen in on their conversation. "I see. A horse," the younger raider said, puzzled. "Who brings a horse out into the desert?" The two men chuckled above his head, causing the rock to vibrate as sound carried through it. "Do you see anything else? Like a person?" The courier slowly snaked his way to the left of the large rock and crouched down before sneaking up towards the raiders. He held his breath and waited for one of them to talk before making any sudden moves. "Nope, just the horse. Maybe they're taking a piss behind a rock or something." "Maybe," the older raider said, bringing his gloved hand to his face and thinking for a moment. Without warning, a blue bolt of electricity shot into the back of the pondering raider, sending arcs of energy through his nervous system. He convulsed for several seconds, which drew the attention of his younger partner, who was now frozen in fear. The courier pressed the barrel of his pistol on the raider's skull, as well as a single knee on his back to pin him to the rock. "Where's your other friend?" the courier asked, deepening his voice in an attempt to sound more threatening. The raider hesitated, shivering as he watched his friend finally finish convulsing. "Talk! I don't know," he screamed, his voice echoing down the side of the mountain. "He told us he would be watching our backs and—" Boom! A loud shot rang out from nearby, quickly followed by a rain of rocky debris as the high-caliber bullet turned the rock near the courier's knee into powder. The shock of the blast caused him to pull the trigger, sending the full effect of his weapon into the skull of the raider. The courier rolled to the side, dropping back down behind the rock and catching his breath for several seconds before peeking over the edge once more. He could see the raider still writhing, blue electricity arcing across his body as it reset his nervous system. Narrowing his eyes, the visor zoomed in on the rocks in the distance, scanning for any sign of movement. A glint of light from the east caught his attention, causing the hairs on his neck to stand on end as his intuition kicked in. He ducked behind cover just before another shot rang out, raining more debris down on his head as the ballistic round struck the stone where his face had been. Knowing that it would take the raider another few seconds to reload, he lifted his head once more and fixed his vision on the location of the glint. Sure enough, he found the target and watched as the raider struggled to unjam his rifle. The courier let out a whistle, catching the attention of his mechanical partner, whose head swung in his direction. He pointed to the rock where the raider was taking shelter, mouthing a command. "Go get him," the courier whispered. Marco snorted loudly, causing it to echo lightly down the side of the mountain, just before the horse began sprinting full speed toward its target. The distinct sound of a metal casing clanked on the rocky ground beneath the raider, followed by a muffled curse as the heavy hoofbeats approached. Taking a deep breath, the courier waited until he heard the shot before rushing the enemy. When it finally came, his steed let out an electronic cry. The courier left the safety of cover and ran with his pistol drawn to finish the fight. Before he could get there, however, he watched as the raider's body was flung several feet into the air, landing with a crunch that sent shivers down his spine. He came to a stop next to his horse, whose metal exterior had been punctured and was leaking a viscous green fluid. "He really got you, huh, boy?" the courier asked, moving in close and inspecting the wound. Marco took a step back, shaking his head several times. "Let me look at it, you big baby." Closing the gap, he opened a metal hatch and began the repairs. After only a few seconds of looking around, he reached his fingers into the chassis and turned a small knob. The stream of leaking fluid slowed to a drip, and the courier removed his hand, closing the hatch before wiping his hands on his trousers. "You're lucky as hell, you know that? It just nicked your coolant line. You'll run a little hot until we can get it fixed, but we're not far from town now." The courier looked over his shoulder and down the other side of the mountain, where a small settlement hugged the edge of a vibrant river that cut through the desert. All manner of foliage and tropical trees lined the banks, and he could see small dots moving to and from the town. He took a step toward the final raider and watched his chest for several seconds, looking for movement. His chest rose and fell. Though his breaths were shallow and ragged, he was still alive. "Let's make our delivery and get you looked at," the courier said to his partner, patting him gently on the head. Cool water trickled down his throat as the courier sipped from his newly filled canteen, sending a wave of relief as the locals peered in his direction. He followed the river, with the only sounds being the stream of flowing water, Marco's hoofbeats, and the soft groans from the bound raiders being dragged behind them. The courier watched as the townspeople gathered around the bridge, their faces lighting up with excitement at the mere sight of him. Taking another sip, the courier wiped the corners of his mouth and waved to them. Displayed on the screen of his bracer were the wanted notices of each of the 3 raiders, with rewards that were enough to get them through the next few seasons with ease. A smile formed on the courier's face, and he patted the side of his horse as they neared closer to their destination.